Let's talk for a few minutes about Senior English A. Our textbook, and if you have yours, I recommend that you have the table of contents open in front of you. Our textbook is actually divided into two volumes. Volume 1 will itemize our first 3 units. And you can see this cleanly in your table of contents right at the beginning of the book. The second volume will then contain units 4, 5, and 6, okay, to constitute the work of your senior year. Now, Senior English A will divide then the book in half. And in Senior English A, we are only working with units 1, 2, and 3. And if you want to, you can kind of flip through your table of contents and you can kind of see that the textbook is divided chronologically. That means we begin with a certain time date and then we kind of work forward chronologically. Now, I'm working on my whiteboard. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with a concept that we call the timeline of Western thought, where we draw a line that looks like a number line in mathematics. We put a 0 in the center. It's kind of arbitrary. Our 0, of course, is what event in Western time? The birth of Christ. Good, yeah, the birth of Christ. We then divide up our timeline into 100-year segments that we call what? Centuries, right? So we sit out here, don't we, at 2013, which is what century? We are in the 21st century. And notice how I wrote that. A 2-1-ST with a big C around it means the 21st century. And then we play this game as well going the other direction, just like negative number in mathematics. The events that occur before the 0 we call before the Common Era, or BCE. The events that occur after the 0 we call Common Era, or sometimes we'll refer to them as AD. That's the kind of old school way to reference them, okay? Now, the advantage of doing this game is that we can then talk a little bit about the important events on the history, on the timeline. So, for example, we can talk about the beginning of Rome at roughly year 200 BCE. The fall of Rome at roughly 410. This is the fall of Rome, which is interesting because it makes Rome how old? How old? About 600 years of history, right? We will talk in our class together about the beginning of English literary history at roughly 1000 Common Era, okay? This will be the text Beowulf, okay? A text that we're about to enjoy, okay? Now watch this. I mean, you remember this from last year as juniors. Tommy and his pals got together and said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, secure these rights, government instituted among men. They said that in what year? Do you remember? And we constituted as kind of the beginning of our nation's history, don't we? What year was that? Do you remember? Right, 1776. What century? What century? 1776 is what century? Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's the 18th century. Now, I've had students that say, that's so dumb to me. Why, if it's 1776, isn't it the 17th century? That would make it so much easier. So, for example, we say Columbus sailed the ocean blue in what? 1492. What century? What century? 1492. 15th century, right? 8 years from what century? 8 years from the 16th century, but I don't understand. If it's 1776, why can't we just call it the 17th century? That'd make it so much easier. A simple answer. We start with 0 when we're counting, don't we? So 0, 50, 80, 98, 99, 100, that's what we call the first century, correct? 150, 180, 199, 200, that's what we call the second century, even though the numbers are the 100s. Make sense? So that's why we have to do it that way. Now, in our textbook, your table of contents will show you that we're going to begin roughly at about 1000 Common Era. We're going to move through the Renaissance of 1600. This is the Renaissance. And then finally, 1700, what we're going to call the Age of Science or Reason. Okay? Then at 1800, we're going to hit the Romantics. And that's going to, for us, be Unit 4, which is Senior English B. Does that make sense? So in other words, another way to say this is, we're going to work from 1000 Common Era to roughly 1800, which is how many years of history? How many years of history? If we go, it's 800 years of history, isn't it? Can you understand why some of our British friends hear Americans say that America is the greatest civilization in the history of the world, and they kind of go, whoa, 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 wait a second. 1776 is how many years ago, roughly? Roughly, America's how old? Roughly. Yeah, we're barely 300 years old. Our English friends will point out, if you use 1000 Common Era as the starting date for British history, literary history, Shakespeare writes Hamlet in 1600. They got 600 years of history just to get to Shakespeare. Can you understand why when they hear Americans say, greatest civilization of all time, can you understand why they go, whoa, 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 why don't you wait until you at least hit year 400? But when you hit year 400, you're still 200 years away from getting to our Shakespeare, which is, of course, just 1600, a few years after Shakespeare still left for the English. Do you understand our point here? Right? I just said, we're going to, in one semester, cover 800 years of history. That just gets us to the romantics of England. Right? In other words, they've been doing this a while. Huh? Right? That's our point. So as we get ready to start, we're going to look at this time period called the Anglo-Saxons. You got it. Now these people are fascinating people. We'll call them Vikings or Norsemen, these warriors. And they define themselves through fighting. The poem that we'll be studying is an epic poem. Now we want to put that word in our notes. Epic poem. What does that mean? Well, an epic poem is a long story that will describe a hero. Okay, a hero. There will have to be a fight or a battle, and the hero's going to have to fight against villains or bad guys. Ultimately, the hero's got to win. Okay? And in the process of going through the fighting and the winning, all kinds of important lessons are learned. Now that's one way to define epic. Another way to define epic is, it's got nothing to do with the hero at all. It's got to do with the people listening to the story. Because these stories are national anthems. Before a ball game, we listen to the Star-Spangled Banner. And although it doesn't mean a lot at the story level to you, maybe always, to people who know the history of America, that song means a lot of history. Beowulf is an epic that tells about a history of a people. Put it in your notes and we'll ask this question in more detail tomorrow. What kind of code did these people, these Anglo-Saxons, follow? What mattered to them? What did they care about? What kind of songs were on their playlist on their iPod? What do you mean? Oh, you haven't thought about that? You are your playlist. You do realize that. If someone wants to know who you are, all she has to do is pick up your playlist and look at it. Now, some of you will say that's not true because I got a lot of crap on my phone or on my iPod I don't listen to. But if I were to ask you to make a playlist of what you do listen to, that tells me who you are. I can learn a lot about you from that, can't I? See, I can. If we were to expand it from playlist to what you watch, as in TV, as in video games, as in movies, all of a sudden now, I can really begin to kind of tell who you are. If we were to expand it even further and you were to itemize where you go and what you do, right? I could kind of start to tell something about you. What do you value? It's fascinating. Some students have tried this. Hit the print key and just study your texts over the last 50 days. We can tell a lot about you from those texts. Who are you talking to and what are you saying says a lot about who you are. So when we study these poems, we actually learn a lot about these people who are the beginnings of what we will call, ultimately, the people English. Why does that matter to us as Americans? Because the first Americans were all English. Well, technically, the first Americans were living here as Native Americans, weren't they? I mean, we studied that last year as juniors, didn't we? But yeah, the Americans that we will often think about as that 1776 group of thinkers, they were first British, weren't they? They were English. And because that's important to them, that they were English, it becomes really important to us to study our English culture. The roots of our American culture are buried there. So we're going to start in Unit 1, and we're just going to kind of work ourselves all the way through. Does that make sense? Everybody groovy with that? That's our work of English, Senior English A. Okay? And of course, we're the Senior English A orange group. The Senior English A black group will be doing the same work of Senior English A. They'll just be beginning at a different point in our timeline. We start there roughly with the Renaissance at 1600. We go from 1600 to 1800, and then we come back. But that's a different section. That's not your section, so you don't have to worry about that. All right? Do you have any